Okay, wonderful. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you online again. We're very, very happy that you come back and join us for this Critical Island Studies monthly Zoom virtual talk. And today we're very happy to turn to Indonesia again. And it's my great honor to introduce to you our moderator for this afternoon. Melani wants me to be very brief. Okay, so Melani Budianta is professor of literary and cultural studies in the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Indonesia. She obtained her PhD from Cornell University, and her area of specialization are women's studies and post-colonial studies. She's a co-editor of 2 anthologies of Indonesian literature, An Ocean of Becoming, Literature from the Indonesian Archipelago, which came out in 2017 by Lontar Foundation. And also Indonesian Women Writers, which came out 2015. That's an anthology dedicated to women writers. Among many other things, okay, she is also the founder of Women Research Institute, which was founded for the causes of women and for women in 2002. And one more thing I'd like to mention is that for those of the audience in Taiwan, Melani, Professor Budianta is really instrumental in the establishment and campaign of Intra-Asia Culture Studies, both the movement and the journal that was led by Chen Guangxin, among others. So I think that this is important for us to know about this coalition across Indonesia and many other parts in Southeast Asia. So I guess with that, I would like to present to you Professor Melani Budianta. Thank you.
Thanks, Yiping, for the generous introduction and also for hosting this 2023 Critical Island Zoom forums since the very beginning. So to all participants, welcome to the 4th session of the forum. And the 4th session shows continuity with the earlier sessions that Yiping has conducted. Today, we are going to talk about Pramoedya, This Earth of Mankind, which ties up with the 1st and 3rd forum on Southeast Asia literature. The 1st forum is on the promotion and translation of Indonesian literature, and the 3rd on discussion of Nick Joaquin's the women who had 2 navels. Yeah? Our discussion is also related to Andy Wang's discussion on geopolitical connection. Yeah. So today we are happy to introduce to you Nila Ayu Utami, who is going to talk about Pramoedya, introduce him as a writer, and also discuss the issues behind his work. Yeah? Nila is a doctoral candidate at present in history at the University of British Columbia. She received her BA in English Studies at our university, Universitas Indonesia, and her master's in Inter-Asia Culture Studies at the National Chiao Tung University. Her broader research interests center around the geography of knowledge production and the histories of social and intellectual movements. She is now writing her dissertation on the relationship between the idea of citizenship and the production of indigeneity as nativity and indigeneity as a claim to belonging. Yeah? Some of her earlier publications include revitalizing area studies. So she is also concerned about area studies. And then also she has talked about Bandung Conference, revisiting Bandung Conference, also reviewing Indonesian 20 years of democracy, She has also been doing research on the history of Indonesian left and the Indonesian New Left. Now, without further ado, I would like to let Nila Ayu Utami present her discussion. Please, Nila, the Zoom is yours.
Thank you so much, Bu Melani, for the very generous and kind introduction, and most definitely to Iping for the invitation and for hosting this. I must say, first and foremost, I think the situation needs to be reversed. Ibu Melani, who is far more of an expert, of Pramoedya, in Indonesian literature and post-colonial studies, than I could ever dream of, should actually be the one giving the call. And I would be more than happy to moderate. But with that said, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to be here and to be talking about Pramoedya. I am joining you from what today is known as Vancouver, located on the territory that was never ceded.
Excuse me, Nila, there is a little bit of echo in your voice. Maybe you could do something.
There's
an echo. Sorry to interrupt.
Let me try this. Is this better?
Yeah.
Oh,
that's
okay.
Better. Much better.
Okay, wonderful. Let me just change a little bit of my setting. Okay. Yeah, so again, I'm joining you from what today is known as Vancouver, located on the territory that was never ceded or given up to the crown by the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I'm grateful to have been a guest on this particular land. It is also midnight here in Vancouver. So please forgive me if I'm reading from my notes because I do not trust my brain during daytime. I have zero trust on my brain capacity at this time of the night. I'm also very grateful to see familiar faces in the audience who are more than familiar and probably know so much more about Pramoedya's histories and works. And so I must apologize if you come here and leave with nothing that you don't already know about Pramoedya. Most of what I will be talking about today is derived from previous researches done on Pramoedya, and by some pure intellectual genealogy luck, I derive mostly from my previous supervisor, historian Hilmar Farid, and my current supervisor, historian John Rosa. So again, I need to really emphasize that I'm by no means an expert on Pramoedya's works and histories, but what I will try to do here is just to highlight some key questions about Pramoedya that might be important for us to think about further, or to think about the key questions that Pramoedya himself was grappling with. Next slide. Yeah, so I will start with talking about, who is Pramoedya Anantatur, and then go on to discuss the novel This Earth of Mankind as the first book of his famous Buru quartet, but also as part of the sort of like the bigger scheme or the longer array of Indonesian historiography that Pramoedya was envisioning, and perhaps, like rewriting from the point of view of historical novels. And then I will try to engage with the idea of historical geography from Pramoedya's perspective, and then end with one of his sort of like less well-known novel that unfortunately has not been translated to English, Arus Balik. Next slide. So yeah, so this is just a quote from Pramoedya, but I think a lot of people has known Pramoedya, and he's widely regarded as one of the greatest authors in Indonesia. He was nominated multiple times for the Nobel Prize in Literature and was awarded the Pen Freedom to Write Award in 1988. And in 2000, at the age of 74, Pramoedya was awarded the Fukuoka Prize for Extraordinary Contributions by Asians. He also received the prestigious Magsaysay Award in 1995, and this developed into quite a debacle in the literary world, with 26 writers and journalists signed a petition in opposition of the decision. And I think one of the signatories who received the same award in 1958, 59, Mukhtar Lubis, actually went to Manila to return his award as a sign of protest. Next slide. Yeah, so Pramoedya, or Pram, was born in a small town of Blora in February 6, 1925, and he passed away in the capital city, Jakarta, on April 30, 2006, at the age of 81. His father, Mastur, he taught in East Java village of Kediri before moving to Blora. And then his mother was the daughter of like a religious court chief. Basically, both of his parents were very well versed in European culture, but at the same time, they did not interact with, the small Dutch-speaking community or other Europeans in Blora. And this was partially, if not primarily, motivated by ideology. His father was very prominent in the nationalist movement, initially as a supporter of the moderate Budianta movement. And then his mother is also equally active and particularly involved in the Swadeshi movement, which sought to boycott foreign products and promote domestic production. And even though his parents were very conversant in Dutch, they persisted on speaking Javanese at home. Now, Pramoedya's father was a school headmaster, but unfortunately, Pramoedya did not enjoy nor thrive in school. Primary school education was the last of his formal education, and even then, I think he had to spend like a decade or so to finish. And his brush, his encounter with the world of printing started after he moved to Jakarta in 1942. There, he stayed with his uncle, Raden Mudikdo, who was a journalist engaged in the activist movement circle. After a few months living in Jakarta, his uncle found him a job at Dome, the news agency of the Japanese army. And his main task was to type news items and feature stories on stencil paper, and then to put the documentation in order. But as an employee, he was also to attend lectures by leading nationalist figures such as Sukarno, Hatta, and Yamin. And so like the seeds of anti-colonial sentiment that was already sort of like planted in the family found even more solid ground and then later blossomed during the revolution. It was also in Jakarta that Pramoedya met Marasutan, a leading literary critic and nationalist intellectual who sort of like acquainted him with the wealth of the Malay and Indonesian literature. Pramoedya was already an avid reader of Western literature, but when in Jakarta, he get to study in Taman Siswa, where he met Marasutan, and there in the Taman Siswa schools, for him studying the less sort of like known tradition of native literature was very sort of purposive. And then every week, Pramoedya was made to visit the library of the former Royal Batavian Society of Arts and Sciences and conduct research on early modern literature and modern history, which basically became his major preoccupation, for the next couple of decades. After the Declaration of Independence, he also briefly served in the Republican Army, but realized that it was not, sort of like his calling. He was captured and sent to the Bukit Duri prison in Jakarta in July 1947, when the returning Dutch army initiated a military operation against the Republican forces. And that was sort of like his first encounter with incarceration. And after his 1949 release from prison, Pramoedya resumed writing prolifically. And then he adopted Jakarta as his home base, and then he became a very renowned novelist. He also visited the Netherlands in 1953. He came to China in 1956, I think by the invitation of the Chinese Writers Association and the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Pramoedya joined Lekra in 1959, a group of artists and writers loosely affiliated with the Communist Party of Indonesia, the PKI. And in the late 1950s, Pramoedya turned his attention more to sort of like historical studies and literary criticism. The first book that came out of this endeavor was the collection of essays, Hokkien in Indonesia. Next slide, please. Sorry. Oh yeah, so this is just a glimpse of like what Pramoedya thought of when he moved to Jakarta, and how moving to Jakarta sort of like transformed his worldview in general. Next slide. Yeah, so this is the first book that came out of his endeavor, and then his attempt to try to more like with historical narrative. This essay, a collection of essays, Hokkien in Indonesia, was written as letters to his friend Chen Sheru about Chinese Indonesians, but this collection was basically like a sharp critique of the presidential order number 10, year 1959, that restricted the movements of foreigners, most particularly Chinese Indonesians, whose citizenship was put in doubt at that time. Now, this book was banned by the military, and Pramoedya was detained without trial for almost 1 year. And upon his release, Pramoedya taught at a university, Res Publica, and he employed a research method for his students that was very much, based on primary source research. So it's very archival, very historical. And then he also became an editor for this magazine Lentera that would become some sort of like fodder for his intellectual thinking about the role of writers in the national stage. Next slide. So Pramoedya believes that literature should be a response to the need of the people. For him, writing was a national task, and I think he used this phrase quite a number of times in interviews, or writing is like a contribution to the national, popular cause. And writing fiction, like any other kind of work, had certain objectives, and it was not the objective in itself. And then, so the liberal inclination toward sort of like pure art was therefore kind of like a betrayal of the hard labor that was put into the production of literature. So according to Pramoedya, literature should be something that gives courage, new values, a new worldview, human dignity, and the role of individual in society. The aesthetics that are focused on language and its use are devoted to a new orientation of the role of the individual in the envisioned society. Next slide. So with that in mind, it is not a surprise then that the burgeoning question that Pramoedya tried to answer or to attempt to tease out in his writing is simply, how did this nation arrive at this point? Like, how come we are here? Like, why has this nation degenerated into such a state? And by engaging this question, I think we would be able to understand his historical novels in better perspective. Next slide. So this Earth of Mankind is the first book of the Buru Quartet. He told and wrote this series in the Buru penal colony after he was detained without trial for his supposed involvement with the Communist Party in 1965. He was moved from prison to prison before he ended up in Buru Island, where he spent, I think, around 10 years of his life. And one important thing is that this series started as a form of like storytelling therapy, because in Buru Island, conditions were very harsh. The treatment from the prison guards were brutal and inhuman, and the physical and mental aptitudes of the prisoners were like rapidly deteriorating. The moral was very low, And so Pramoedya took the initiative of telling stories to other prisoners with the hope that, it would raise, their hope a little bit. And the first story was about a strong female character, the nyai of a plantation owner who struggled for dignity and respect. That is Nyai Ontosoro. So in that sense, the first brick that would later form the famous Buru Quartet had already been laid there. But I think it is also very important to emphasize that Pramoedya did not do this mammoth of a task on his own. In Buru Island, prisoners were separated in different camps and different barracks. And so other prisoners basically helped convey the stories and form a network of storytellers. And thus, the task of preserving and keeping the stories alive is one of communal efforts, which required, people sharing, smuggling, and hiding the stories. In general, the Buru Quartet basically it challenges the idea of the Indonesian nation, and the state as a natural sort of outcome of a common history. And the first novel, This Earth of Mankind, is set in East Java in 1898. Okay, that was difficult, particularly in Surabaya. So the audience is introduced to Minke, an 18-year-old native Javanese student who is the only native student in the Dutch high school, HBS in Surabaya. And this time period, it's roughly 3 decades after the publication of Max Havelaar, or, according to Pramoedya, the book that killed colonialism by Multatuli, and a decade before the Dutch colonial government enacted, the ethical policy that promoted more access to education for the native. Now, there are other Dutch high school in Java. I believe one in Batavia and the other is in Semarang. But the choice of setting the novel in Surabaya is one that I think speaks more to the larger history that Pramoedya is interested in, and I hope to discuss later. So the novel basically provides us with glimpses of colonial reality, but also looking at them from different point of views. We have Minke's brush with the colonial world outside of the European knowledge he encountered through schooling and education and books, that he read and marveled at, and also through his encounter and conversations at the plantation in Wonokromo with his friends, Jean Marais, Miriam Delacroix, and many others. He sort of formed a collage of colonial realities that were different from Europe as an ideal that he received in school. Of course, another major event that he encountered is also confronting the colonial reality in the form of the legal system in his fight to keep Annelies as his legal wife. But I think Pramoedya's major difference with both the colonial and national historical narratives in describing this kind of colonial reality is his rejection of the binary categories of the West and the East, Europe, Asia. And in the quartet, I think that these binary categories are, they are interrogated, they're given new meaning. You see the dilemma or the battle, especially in Minke, right? For him, Europe signifies progress and modernity on the one hand, but also at the same time, he sees that Europe is the cause of suffering on the other. Now, out of these brushes with different colonial realities, Minke learned and experienced injustices and inequalities, and then become, a defendant of rights and dignity, exposing the many faces of the colonial governance through his writings, through his pen. He became increasingly critical of the Europe he once saw as an ideal, after which, sort of the native society should be modeled upon. And then he begins to see the wide gap between modern European principles of, freedom, justice, and equality on the one hand, and the practice of European rule in the colonies on the other. And, the progress or developments in the former do not necessarily result in changes in the latter. And I think more importantly, he sees that the development of Europe is made possible by the exploitation of the colonies. Now, excuse me, we know that Pramoedya modeled Mingke from Tirto Adisuryo, and how important a focus on Tirto is in the retelling of Indonesian historiography. And I want to highlight how his interest in Tirto culminates. Next slide. So after he was, as I mentioned before, after he was released from prison for writing Hokkien in Indonesia, Pram accepted an offer to teach Indonesian literature and history at Respublika, and then also accepted the offer to become the editor of Lentera. So according to historian Hilmar Farid, around this time period, Pram actually wrote a lot of commentaries, lectures, and speeches, so more nonfiction writings that can be read as like fragments of his intellectual project. And during his years working in Lentera, Pramoedya developed an exploration of the material sort of like history of Indonesian literature, particularly the political economy of printing and publication. He probably was the first Indonesian scholar to pay serious attention to the subject. Pramoedya traced the colonial domination over the material production of knowledge, and how that hampered the emergence of critical thinking and a counter-public sphere among the native population. His research was very meticulous, with solid information about newspapers, publishers, owners, editors, starting with the Indo-European and the Peranakan Chinese, who laid the political and linguistic foundations for the rise of a pre-Indonesian literature. In that sense, his interest in Tirto Adisuryo sort of like made perfect sense, right? Because Pram understood the rise of the national consciousness or the national awakening as a very like material struggle. This is why Tirto was given a very special place in Pramoedya's historiography. Tirto was not only, the pioneer of ideas, but also probably the first pribumi, the first native who set up a printing company and publisher to support and protect the propagation of ideas. But his interest in Tirto actually came through because one of his students in Respublika found Tirto's diary, or so claimed by Oh Him Hui, one of the prisoners in Buru Island, that helped Pramoedya smuggled and hid his manuscripts. And the Lentera years was also interesting because then he also wrote about the importance of indigenous literary texts as sources. So Pramoedya was one of the first few Indonesians to think of, the indigenous traditional literary texts not only as sources of historical facts, but also sort of like a social documents or records of, indigenous knowledge about the distant past. And sort of like this is kind of like in opposition to the supposed scientific methods of colonial knowledge production that separate fact from fiction, myths from reality, and consequently also separating the text from their cultural or historical contexts, which in turn limited kind of like alternative readings of the sources. Now, before Buru Island, Pramoedya's plan to write a novel about this, like national awakening was already conceived. So this is like in the 60s, in this time period. He immersed himself in the state archives, nationalist newspapers and other historical materials of that period. His main impetus was the growing sort of like uneasiness of Indonesian leftist intellectuals with the legacies of the Dutch colonial historiography, which still held great sway at that time. So Pramoedya was among those who claimed that the dominant historical narrative of the national awakening was highly distorted. He pointed out how colonial scholar bureaucrats like, the infamous Snaukur Gronje, my apologies if I butcher the Dutch, like these colonial bureaucrats not only directly interfered with the nationalist movement, but also determined the way the movement was to be remembered in later years. And, with full access to the state archives, the scholar bureaucrats had the power to erase people, events, and organizations from historical memory. And of course, among the victims of this practice was Tirto Adi Suryo, the chief editor and owner of Medan Priai, the first native newspaper in the Indies, and also the founder of the first modern native organization, Sarekat Dagang Islamiyah, or the Islamic Trade Union, who became, of course, the model for Minke, the main protagonist of the Buruk Quartet. And so for Pramoedya, Tirto Adi Suryo was the originator of the nationalist movement, and writing about his journey would therefore be a perfect starting point for rewriting the history of the nation. Next slide. But then, what was the need to rewrite the historiography of the nation? I suppose we can go back to the question Pramoedya attempted to answer or articulate through his historical novels. How did the nation arrive at this point, right? And I think we can read Pramoedya along with other post-colonial novels and their reading of the nation. And by doing that, it might be clear that while post-colonial reading of the nation often focuses on the destabilizing of the nation as a political project, Pramoedya was a staunch nationalist, although probably a different kind. And we can read the quartet as a way, as the narrative that promoted the nation as a viable form of anti-colonial politics, and argue against the dominant historical narrative that the national awakening was an event that started with like a particular thing, which is the foundation of Budi Utomo, the history of which, or the narrative of which, we can read in the second installment, Child of All Nations. In the dominant historical narrative, the national awakening was an event which took the foundation of Budi Utomo on May 20th, 1908 as its birth date. And Pramoedya rejected this notion of, the Budi Utomo as the progenitor of the nationalist movement and the idea of the awakenings as mere event. For him, it was definitely more complicated. It's a more complicated process that took place over a certain period of time and involved, local political practices on the one hand, and then so like transnational ideologies on the other. It was an amalgam of like diverse and often conflicting ideas from, pan-Islamism to socialism to Javanese mysticism and conventional historiography, which focuses on like formal organizations, particular people, particular leaders. They would not be able to sort of like tease out the process or understand the process in its entirety. Especially if, this conventional historiography is like burdened with the task of identifying an important dates, events, particularly for ceremonial purposes. And Pramoedya's attempt to rewrite this historiography is thus a challenge to this selected interpretation of the colonial national historical discourse, in which the native elite, as in the case of Budi Utomo, asserted themselves as the rightful inheritors of the archipelago, who were to replace the Dutch, once independence was gained. And it was a liberation of the homeland from foreign power, but not a social and spatial reorganization of the society that has suffered under colonial oppression. In fact, spatial order, including the geographical borders and administrative divisions, were maintained and thought to be unproblematic at all. Additionally, the Indies, like Europe and many other places, is also a society of contradiction. And Minke examines what he called the hierarchy of the social ladder, on which the king's family and the priai is placed on the top, and then the traders in the middle, and then the commoners on the lowest rank. So class is definitely an important political category and clearly marks the difference of one character from the other. Even though I'm not necessarily sure that Pramoedya would agree that, we should use the category of class to kind of like understand Indonesian society. Furthermore, we also see the importance of place in this earth of mankind. School, for one thing, is where Minke received his education about Europe, but at the same time, it's also the place where he experienced the social racial hierarchy in ways that he probably has never sort of like experienced before. The other place that is extremely important is, of course, the plantation at Wonokromo. And this plantation is different from other stories about colonial plantation, exactly because it was run and supervised by a native woman, Nyai Ontosoro. Minke's impression of the plantation is also something very interesting because as much as it is a colonial enterprise, Minke also saw, there's servants who do not bow in front of their masters. There's the presence of many women in the workforce, and of course, the presence of Nyai Ontosoro herself. And I see Minke's travels from, Wonokromo to Surabaya, plantation to school, as also the travel of his knowledge accumulation that reach a point of understanding that school is too small for him, that the school is too small for his persona. And this is like, something that actually Jean Marais has mentioned from the beginning, that the school is no longer for him. It is also through these travels that for Minke, the process of getting to know the harsh realities of the colonial world is a very complex one. He goes through sort of like a series of moments of realization in which, his imagined ideals of Europe were challenged by reality. It is made clear to him that the Europeans in the colonial world will not share their freedom and principles of equality with the natives. Segregation is very much a mode of life. The justice system is discriminatory, even for Minke, who has sort of like gained equalized status. And there's a scene where Nyai was not allowed to speak in Dutch in the courtroom and is forced to speak in Javanese because of her ethnic origin, but then she opts for Malay instead. So the Dutch colonial court prevents the access of native people to the institutions of the modern state and forces them to stay in tradition with all, sort of like the backwardness that it is associated with. And so the choice of Nyai Ontosoro to speak in Malay can be seen or can be read as a form of resistance and rejection of, sort of like a caged tradition that is imposed by the European rulers. And I think it was in Malay too that Minke explores colonial reality with a new perspective. But this would become like more apparent in the second book, Child of All Nations. Next slide. So I think I hope it should be clear after reading This Earth of Mankind, at least, that history and geography are very prominent in Pramoedya's writings. In this next sections, I want to discuss Pramoedya's interest in history and geography, and in a way, his verdict of the lack of historical and geographical imagination in the time and process of decolonization. And I think for Pramoedya, writing historical novels is an invitation for us to rethink the historical record with new ideas and new questions. And he mentioned in one of the essays that he wrote that he started with the Bumi Manusia tetralogy, specifically working on the currents that came and went during the period of Indonesia's national awakening and become a new reality, a literary reality, a downstream reality whose origin is the same upstream historical reality. And I picked this particular quote because I think it's interesting and peculiar because he was using a riverine metaphor with a particular resonance in Southeast Asia. And this is very topological, very geographical, right? And he described the historical novel as possessing a downstream reality whose origin is the same upstream reality, the historical reality. So the way I read it is that the novel is not meant to supply an accurate representation of the facts of the historical reality, but to express something of its spirit. So the reader is expected to gain a reorientation or evaluation of the civilization and culture. Next slide. So I want to highlight some ideas on this historical geographical conjunctures, particularly in this Earth of Mankind. So first of all, why Surabaya, right? What about this place that is significant, not only in the way the story is told, but also in Pramoedya's larger historical narratives or larger interest in the historiography? And when I was reading the translated version of this Earth of Mankind, there's the translator's note, right? And I think Max Lane in his translator's note mentioned about the significance of Surabaya. He said, and I quote, the port of Surabaya was an old town that grew up around a major harbor. So in a way, like Surabaya became this hub for spices, for people, for ideas. But what he did not mention is how the state of Surabaya as a hub was in a way already a reverse course from the Majapahit kingdom era that Pramoedya invested his research in. In a sense, the Surabaya that we witness in the novel is already a dwarfed form of its previous glory. Can you go to the next slide? Excuse me, sorry. Yeah, so Pramoedya wrote, in my country in 1614, the most powerful Javanese king, the interior king, Sultan Agung, destroyed the Surabaya trading port nation just because he needed validation of his power. The irony of Javanese history is contained here. When the Dutch circled the world for spices, Surabaya, a transit port for the same spices for international consumption, was destroyed by a Javanese inland king. So my sense is that Surabaya became the setting, not just because it's a port city or like a hub for colonial power, but that its longer history reveal a defeat due to the lack of imagination from previous ruler who could not envision connection and trajectory beyond the land. And thus, their geographical reality was limited to inland, and this remained embedded in their collective imagination. And Minka can only marvel, at the ideas flowing into the Indies, from books and letters, but he himself has never ventured outside of his zone. Can you go back to the previous slide? Thank you. And so why Minka, right? I think it's interesting to see that Minka too is the product of that larger history, which sealed the fate of Surabaya. He becomes the perfect vessel for an amalgamation of different ideas of what constitutes the nation. While in the nationalist discourse, the painful experience of discrimination kind of like induced a negative reaction or the longing for a distant, authentic, united past. In Minka's case, it is different because he's very critical of his Japanese aristocratic background. And he announces early in the novel that he would not become a bupati, right? An official, like other educated children of the Javanese priai. This is a choice that was so rarely chosen, right, for men of his stature, but one that actually takes him further instead of like locking him in his birthplace, as we shall read in the next books. And his father's house in B is the representation of the Japanese culture that he criticizes, of a past that he wants to just like simply do away with or abandon. And it's clearly expressed in his description of the house and its feudal atmosphere. And this is in very strong contrast with the modern life of the urban center. And in a way, his modern knowledge is suspended by the hierarchical Japanese culture. And I think his criticism of the Japanese aristocrats is also a criticism of the native elite rulers who became compradors instead of liberators of their people, as well as a critique to Japanese civilization, which refused to look outward. And this too was written in history, which I hope will be a little bit clearer when we discuss the next section. And the ending of this Earth of Mankind is in a way a story of defeat, right? But of what defeat? I think it's not simply the defeat in the court, in the defeat of losing Annelies, but the fact that they were not allowed to set foot outside of their house. They could not take Annelies to the port as they were under house arrest. So like this being kind of like locked in land, at least in this particular moment in the quartet, to me, it bears more significance in terms of the way Pramoedya also sees sort of like the nation's land-based history. I think it is also a defeat of the maritime nation / history that culminated into this particular moment in the novel, where the supposed descendants of the sea roaming ancestors were not even able to leave the land. And the reason I mention this is because the Buru tetralogy, the Buru quartet, was also written alongside a trilogy of historical novels that focus on the rise and fall of the great maritime empire, Majapahit. And when read together, they form some sort of like upstream and downstream historical reality. Next slide. Oh, next slide again, sorry. Okay, so I think it's important to read the tetralogy, not on its own, but also to read them along with Pramoedya's other historical novels. And I think only then Pramoedya's questions of why this nation has become this way form a more complex answer. It is not just that colonialism, is the evil of all evils, but that even before colonialism proper, the lack of political and geographical imagination of the past kingdoms sort of like sowed the seeds for degeneration. So this novel, Arus Balik, technically it's translated to English as A Changing Tide, but I'm going to join my supervisor, John Rosa, in using the translation reversing course instead. So this is a novel about Java's lost maritime empire. It is set in the early 16th century, roughly 1510, 1530, when the Majapahit Empire had just recently collapsed. And the rulers of the successor states that have emerged in its stead face a moment of decision, whether to attempt to recreate the empire or jealously guard their own little kingdoms. One of the main characters in the novel is the ruler of the kingdom of Tuban, which Pramoedya kind of like presents as, the possible successor to the Majapahit Empire, the most powerful of the small kingdoms. And he had just led a secret federation of governors to end the centralized power of the Majapahit kingdom and carve his own kingdom. But it is the decision of this particular ruler that is of the greatest importance for the future of Java and the archipelago. He has the ability to recreate the empire if he so chooses. That he chooses not to, even in the face of the Portuguese threat, signals the end of the Majapahit era of cosmopolitanism and the return of Java to what Pramoedya termed as kampung civilization. Next slide. So this Kampung civilizations is a provincial civilization, resembling a person that does not look beyond the borders of his or her own neighborhood or a kampung and attempt to understand the world. So for Pramoedya, Java's problems did not actually begin with colonialism. That the Javanese could have ever become colonized in the first place by so few people from so far away indicates kind of like an internal weakness that cannot be covered up by praising that superiority in weapons and technology or condemning that savagery. I think Java, and I joined my supervisor in this argument. For Pramoedya, Java was already in the thrall of narrow-minded, ignorant rulers that, despite opportunities to kind of like build stronger states or modernize, they actually prefer to persist in running small kingdoms that could not compete with a threat from Europe. Pramoedya captured, this transition from the great maritime era to the emergence of the Kampung civilization in this post-Majapahit transition in the image of the traffic of ships heading to and from Java. The small successor states were in no position to continue Majapahit's practice of like sending convoys to far-off destinations, and they could only receive ships coming from elsewhere. And this is on the right side is a quote that I took from the novel Arus Balik, in which the narrator mentioned, now fewer and fewer Japanese ships sail to the north, to the lands above the wind, such as Champa or China. The stream of ships to the north became reduced to a trickle. The stream to the south, however, became wider and swifter, carrying new commodities, new ideas, new religions. So the novel's title, Arus Balik, refers to this reversal of Java's position in the world, from venturing out into the world itself to kind of like remaining stationary and receiving others. Arus Balik is a current, particularly a current of water that turns back and heads to the other direction. And I think the effect of this, Arus Balik, can be seen in a snippet from a letter that Pramoedya wrote to his daughter when he was on board of a ship to Buru Island. Next slide, please. Sorry, next slide.
Maybe you can just, read.
Oh, there you go. Sorry. Next slide, Frank. Okay, thank you. So in this letter, Pramoedya wrote, for far too many of the prisoners on board, this journey is not only their first time at sea, but also the first they have ever set foot outside of their home village. Can you imagine? These men are supposed to be citizens of a maritime nation. In primary school, Indonesian children are told that they are the descendants of a maritime people who roam the seas. Yet here on this ship, most of the prisoners are sprawled helplessly on the mats that line the deck. As the ship cuts through the open sea, they heave their guts, they retch and heave some more. So Pramoedya has been drawn to both the nationalist movement and to the Majapahit Empire as sort of like cosmopolitan moments, right? In an otherwise, like lengthy history of blinkered provincialism. And according to Rosa, Pramoedya writes not as a sort of like a detached, kind of like professional, objective historian, but actually as a Javanese, who feels a strong sense of having been victimized by his own ancestors. Not by just any one person or group of people in particular, but by kind of like a long entrance of social structure of civilization. And I think Pramoedya, as is Minka, was victimized by this kampung civilization, right? By the failure of a possible maritime outward-looking civilization. And there's bitterness and longing in the way Pramoedya writes about these histories. And although Minka's journey in the Buruk Quartet kind of like started at the plantation in Wonokromo, I think the journey as a people had been hampered already by the lack of like political and geographical imagination that in turn made them subjects of colonial power and then of national ideology, basically, after independence that would present its back to the ocean. Next slide. So these are the trilogy that I mentioned before. I'm still reading them, so I cannot give you a lot of information. This is a very heavy, books. And unfortunately, none of them has been translated to English. And the last piece of the trilogy, Mata Pusaran or Whirlpool, remain unpublished, unfortunately. And I think, yeah, it's the Buruk Quartet has been very well received, has been very well known, but reading the Buruk Quartet along with this other historical novels would offer us glimpses of the questions that Pramoedya had been striving to answer. I'll stop here. I hope that this has been informative of Pramoedya and then the histories out of which his works emerge. And I hope I can answer your questions if you have some.
Wow, Nila, thank you so much for this very rich discussion on Pramoedya's works, his lives, and it's very relevant to the critical island studies and what you are discussing. His grappling with the hinterland mentality. How the nation is defeated because its failure in looking outward towards the ocean. Yeah, there are so many issues that we can discuss here. Also about Nyai Ontosoro and actually he also wrote about Kartini, right? So his position, position as a, maybe you can call it a feminist thinker. We will talk about this, yeah. And so I will open up the discussion for anybody who would like to ask question to Nila. Please raise your hand or directly write in chat or raise your hand, yeah. And maybe Iping can also help me if you see anybody who raised their hand. Oh, here there is Ibu Retno raising their hand, yeah. Ibu Retno Mamoto. Yes, please, Ibu Retno. Maybe you can ask your question. Yes, Ibu Retno. Yeah. Please unmute yourself. Yes.
Am I heard?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Because my laptop has been gone.
No problem.
I don't know where the voice. Yeah. And then now came back. So I was so glad. Otherwise, I have to write on the chatting. Thank you so much for this wonderful research of Mbak Nila. And I was so thankful to be here. And Ibu Melani is hosting us, and also Iping from the center. I'm very grateful and thank you. I wonder if you present Pramoedya as a loner person, and then I realized that all the books were all written in Buru. I admire him. I watched the movies, of course, but I was not aware that he was so alone in feeling that strong about not only on colonialism, but also in President Sukarno. So his, to me, is not only against anything that is reigning our country. So I think his observation is very complete and marvelous. And then he was, charged, okay, of course, by being a member of Communist Party. That's probably the reason of everything. But then his observation was very keen in presenting like the birth of nationalism. Even he did not agree to Budi Utomo. I realized that's the only source to me how nationalism started in Indonesia is by Budi Utomo. Apparently it's nothing because they are all priais and they don't know, the world on the earth because they've been, very elite and trained that way. I wonder if they're elite, but they were trained to think like the masters, how the masters teach the Indonesian elite at those days, the administrators who rule our own country. So to me, there is a second stage of colonialism reigned by Indonesian. And that's the only one Pramoedya could go through these things. And I think that's my comment that I feel very strongly to speak up about the situation that's being portrayed in all his novels. Thank you, Ibu.
Thank you. Maybe we can listen to one more question before you answer together. Yeah, there is Putami here who would like to ask question. Please, Putami.
Yeah, I'm having my, yes. Ibu, can you hear me? Because
Yes,
I'm having
yes.
sore throat now.
It's okay.
Just
Putami.
want to know whether you see the connection between the tetralogy and Arus Balik, because you mentioned also about Arus Balik. I see somehow there is a kind of the power of strength, how to see the strength behind any difficulties. So do you see anything relevance and connection among the tetralogy books and Arus Balik? Thank you, Ibu. To Mbak Nila, sorry.
Okay, thank you, Putami. Maybe while waiting for others to raise their hand or ask question in the chat, maybe you can answer, Nila, please.
Of course, thank you, Bumel. Ibu Retno, thank you so much for the question. It's been a while, so this is such a, I don't know, I'm having a lot of feelings right now because we used to share an office space together many, like 5-6 years ago, and yeah, it's such an honor to be in this platform again with you, Ibu. Yeah, your comment about how Pramoedya was probably a loner, and this I did not know of this before as well. But as I read more and more about Pramoedya, I also began to understand that even though he was part of Lekra, and Lekra in its nature is kind of like very communal, right? It's people based. So, you kind of like have to work together, you do things together. But based on what I have read about Pramoedya, he was not, that kind of person. So even though he's associated with Lekra, or he joined and he became, I think, really high in the Lekra sort of like committee organization, he was never that kind of like a communal person to begin with, sharing of things in the way Lekra would like to do things. So he's kind of like an oddball, right? He's very much an oddball, and I think he finds himself very much thriving in archives. He reads a lot, he did a lot of research, and I think that's when he really like found his quote unquote home. And it's also very telling, right? Because his compilation of essays / biographies, it's titled The Mute Soliloquy. So it's also like a person's monologue, right? So yeah, I completely agree that it's fascinating how from a person that is, you could probably say a loner or an individualist or something along that lines, but that also allows him to be very much deep in his thoughts, deep in his research, to think and rethink about the nation as a political project. So yeah, very much so, Ibu Retno. So thank you so much for that. And then the other question by Butami about the connection between the quartet and Arus Balik, I think I don't know whether the connection is real or I probably just made it up. But the way I see the connection is exactly what I mentioned earlier, that, you know, I think the national historiography that started with the Buru tetralogy was not necessarily an origin story, that it was already hampered by previous histories. And I think this was kind of like the call that Pramoedya wanted us to revisit, right? If we think of Indonesia as a nation, it did not immediately start there. It did not immediately start at this particular moment in history where there's printing, where there's newspaper, the kind of idea that Benedict Anderson would, argue in his book, Imagine Communities. And it did not start with Budi Utomo, but, you know, when we imagined the possibilities of Indonesia, we need to also see the trajectory of its histories from way before. And that's why I see Minke as unique, but also very, very interesting in the sense that he never traveled, right? He never really like went out of his sort of like small enclave. And I made that connection between like looking at Minke never leaving his small enclave to this idea of a kampung civilization that Pramoedya put a verdict on after the fall of the Majapahit kingdom, and that he also wrote in Arus Balik. So it's a reversal, and or it's a return to that hinterland or inland kind of framework that became, you know, the fall or the degeneration of the nation in the future. So yeah, again, I don't know whether that connection is valid or fair, but that's how I read the connection between Arus Balik and the quartet.
Thank you very much, Nila. I would like later to call on Vince and Lulu and Iping to also comment or ask questions. But while we are waiting for them, maybe you can discuss more about Pramoedya's perspective, you know, very inclusive perspective. Yeah, because he, in Huaqiao, he critiqued the racist policy of banning or the Chinese traders from residing in rural area. Yeah, that's creating another problem later on in our histories. And also his presentation of women, you know, and our critique about the position of women in not only in colonial structure, but also in national structure. Okay, maybe you can talk that and talk about that, and then I will. Here I have some other people commenting or chatting. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibu Mel. Yeah, Huaqiao was written also after his return from China. And I think, if I remember correctly, when he was in China, he was, you know, absolutely amazed by the way the Chinese government treated their authors, right? You know, with very much, like, with so much respect. And I think, if I remember correctly, he was also there for a celebration of Lucian. And he has never seen something like that before, right? There was no precedent. And so seeing that, he absolutely has this idealized image of China, and also very selected image as well, right? Because of course, as a guest, he was only presented, you know, to or are taken to events that would be favorable, or that would give him a favorable impression of the state. So upon his return, and then looking at the way the Indonesian state actually treated its Chinese Indonesian citizens, he was very disturbed, and that's why he wrote Hokyal in Indonesia. And he wanted the term Hokyal to actually take roots. You know, we don't say Chinese Indonesians, but we say Hokyal instead. And it was a very noble, I would say, and very incredible attempt on his part to try to change the meaning of Hokyal from kind of like a diasporic Chinese to just Indonesian Chinese. Of course, we know that did not take flight, unfortunately. And I think Pramoedya's treatment or the way Pramoedya positioned women and his stories, I would imagine that it also has something to do with his mother, who, you know, was a very strong, vocal, you know, woman. You know, she although she was born in a rather sort of like conventional religious family, she still took part in the nationalist movement, you know, very ideological as well. So it's with growing up with that kind of parents, you know, give him more ideas of the place of women in society. And I think another thing was probably also the way he encountered the erasure of Kartini's thoughts and letters, right? Because if I remember correctly, when he knew the breadth of Kartini's works and how a lot of it has been, you know, what you call it, censored or changed, that gave him sort of like more impetus, you know, to really position women in the mainstream of national thoughts.
Thank you so much, Nila. Now there is this question from Eric. Can Eric please just read aloud? It's about orality. It's very interesting. Can you just ask your questions, Eric? Oh, he doesn't have a mic. All right, so let's read this question. Okay, since the novel was first orally composed and transmitted among his fellow prisoners, and in the beginning of the novel there seems to be a contrast between local orality and writing as related to Western colonial knowledge, and the novel remains very multilingual throughout. Would you comment on how this oral composition and transmission of the novel in relation to writing of the novel, and how in the novel speech and writing are presented? Okay, very interesting question. Very good question.
I would say so. I don't know if I have the knowledge to answer this question in full form. In terms of how the novel was first orally composed, that is definitely, how do I say, circumstantial. So not circumstantial. It's because of the circumstances, right? He was not given access to pen and papers. So that's one thing. And then the second thing that I mentioned earlier in the talk was that the morale was very low with the prisoners. So, you know, if there's something that can give them, you know, a little boost, then that would be very, very good. So that's why Pramoedya started to tell the stories orally and thus transmitted among his fellow prisoners. But then after, I think 1973, if I remember correctly, he was then given access to pen and paper and what you call that, a typewriter. Then he began to type it, right? But even after he received this, you know, access to writing his stories in written forms, they would still need to like smuggle and hid. So it's still not out in the open, and even though he already had access to the writing of it. the contrast between local orality and writing as related to Western colonial knowledge. This is also very fascinating because if I think, and Pramoedya understood this very well because many of the sort of like local stories were basically delivered in oral forms, right? Through storytellings, Baba Tanah Jawi and everything else. You know, it's very rich exactly because it was told and it was conveyed in oral form. So it could be different from region to region. You know, the stories can take different forms, different tweaks and twists and turns. But then, you know, because of the colonial knowledge and the need to kind of like put a cage or put a border, put a category on these stories, you know, they have to write the story down, and then, you know, it lost its life basically after a lot of the myths and a lot of the stories that had been transferred from generations to generations in colonial Java were put in written forms. So I think, yeah, Pramoedya acutely understood this, what how do I say, stories in written form can do. But at the same time, you know, like you mentioned, Eric, the multilingualness throughout the novel is definitely purposive, right? Also a reality in that society at that time, because people do speak of different language. You know, you use Malay for certain purposes. There's also Low Malay. There's also the ethnic language Javanese. There's also Dutch. So the way he can, or Minke can travels from one particular language to another is a reality of the native elites or the elites at that time. And their speech, but there's also letters and the way they are presented. And I think it's just very masterful. But I cannot speak more onto, you know, to what extent this presenting the novel in this particular form is also, how do I say, Pramoedya's commentaries on the colonial knowledge system that forces the larger traditional indigenous literary texts became written texts instead.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Nila. You earlier, I think you mentioned a little bit about the Pramoedya's critical methods of knowledge production, which differs from the formal historiography, you know, which separates facts and fiction. And through rewriting history in the form of fiction, I think he can weave all these resources, oral, written, whatever, in lingual form. Yeah, do you think so? Into a presentation, a historical critique, or another form of knowledge production. Do you think so?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's probably more apparent in the other trilogy, in Arok Dedes, Arus Balik, because there's not a lot of, like, how do I say, historical sources that he can derive these stories from, right? But he can derive it from myths, you know, from sort of like local indigenous literary texts. But not so much of the kind of like historical sources that the scientific method would ask of an author to do. So this play on writing historical novels, I think, probably more apparent in the trilogy than it is in the tetralogy, which is very much clearly based on a particular historical narrative of Tirto Adisuryo.
Thank you so much. Others, please. Yes, there is some. There is this to chat from Alex. Yeah, Alex, would you like to speak directly, and then Lulu?
Okay. Hello. I'll just read it out. Thank you for the talk. Is it? Yes, I want to ask about this feeling of regret that, or maybe it's anger, or at least complaint about the inwards turn. So then if you're referring to trajectories, then what alternative trajectory is Pramoedya imagining? And then, so I think maybe the alternative model is Meiji Japan, and this sort of quick modernization and adaptation model. But then I don't think this was ever a certain possibility. So then, I mean, another interpretation is that it's a continued shame of defeat. I'm really not sure what is particular about Indonesia's self-focused politics, say, but are there other closed feelings which you might be aware of that concern Pramoedya? Thank you.
Okay, Nila? Should I answer? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Alex, for the question. I think this observation of, the regret or the kind of like the bitterness or anger I found after reading a few of, his commentaries or his essays, where, he would draw upon this image of the Majapahit kingdom, as I mentioned, it was very cosmopolitan. And he how do I say, he really did not like the subsequent kingdom after the fall of Majapahit, which was Mataram, whom he believed kind of like, impose or return Java to the Kampung civilization. And in some of his other essays, he would talked about how in post-colonial Indonesia, the existence of the army, which is very much land-based, is very strong. And, with a focus of army, we often forget the oceans. We often forget that we are maritime people. So I see this as a kind of like a as a recurring theme in Pramoedya's essays. It might be, in a way, you can see it as kind of like harmless in the sense that, it's you see it here and you see it there, but because you see a lot of this, it became kind of like a pattern on which he sees, the inward turn as the failure of cosmopolitanism, as the failure of opening up, as the failure of connection, of a possible trajectory, of a possible connection. Maybe the alternative is, or at least in Arus Balik, the way the governor of Tuban chose not to extend the empire, but just to guard the Tuban kingdom. I think that was, if he could, revisit that and rewrite a different sort of like historiography, that would not be something that he would choose to do. But he did not. And I think what he wanted to convey is that this was, this was a conscious choice of the kingdom of Mataram, of Sultan Agung at that time, to not connect and to just be their own small little kingdom. And I think he really, he just felt victimized by this choice of of his ancestors, of the previous rulers who did not choose to open up, but instead choose to close itself in. And whether or not this was something that was shared by his contemporaries or even, by the subsequent generation is a great question, because, we always sees Indonesia as tanah air, which basically is translated to land, water. But then, in the English translation, it's just homeland, right? But we only see ourselves as maritime people in history, but not in contemporary reality, if that makes sense. So I think his verdict does have merit because we forgot that part of our history. But it's also it can also be right as a dangerous nostalgia, right, of a past that never was. But again, I think the goal that Pramoedya will aim to achieve is just to open up that political and geographical imagination of a nation that could be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's very interesting, Nila. Yeah, we still have to think what kind of future in the sea does he imagine? I mean, for Indonesian, it's related to the question. But now Lulu is asking a question, and she would like me to read it. Okay. Nila, hello Nila. My literature students in the Philippines have observed the recurrence of the image of space versus place, or territoriality versus open fields in this earth of mankind, rendering the novel a shuttling or shifting between stasis versus movement, building a sense of tension and release as the narrative unfolds alongside Minke's character development, being shaped as he moves from place to place, evoking a tension between nativist nationalism and intellectual cosmopolitanism thematically. Can you comment on that in relation to what you have mentioned as the bifurcation between land and water in Pram's work? Pram's work. Okay, Nila.
Wow, this is a big question too. I think your students have made astute observation of this recurrence of the image of space versus place, and then the tensions between them in relation to the bifurcation between land and water in Pram's work. The way I see it is that at least in the first novel, because I was like trying to really think about what is the role of water, at least in this earth of mankind, right? Because when I read let's say the Mute Soliloquy, a lot of it is connected to, let's say, being on the ship. It's also like an island surrounded by water. It's basically a prison island, right? And the only way to get to the camp is to take a kind of, what you call that, a water motor boat, raft. Yes, yes, something along that lines. So I tried to see, so what is the role of water here in this earth of mankind? And it was very difficult to kind of like grasp at it, right? Because everything was very much focused on land. The only thing that I can find, and maybe other people would be able to be sort of like more detailed or find a different answer, is that the incoming, first of all, the incoming of ideas that is from Europe, but also the incoming of threats in different forms. For example, the arrival of Herman Maurits Melema, the kind of the legal son, right? The legal son of Melema, came through ships, right? Coming through water. So that's kind of like the incoming bound. But we never see, at least the main characters, leaving. So it's always something incoming. The only character that leaves is Annelies, which in a way already occupies two worlds, right? Because she's biracial. And even when Annelies left, Minke and Nyai Ontosoro did not get to see the port, so did not even get to be near water in that sense. So I struggled so much to see what is the role of water in Pram's work, at least in this tetralogy. And I wonder, I don't know if I would have time to sort of like look at it further. And I wonder if beyond this earth of mankind, let's say maybe in footsteps when he had to be sent to, couldn't remember where is the island called right now, but he was sent to exile. I wonder if there is something that in a way signifies or hints at, you know, the idea of water and connection. But again, because I couldn't find it in this earth of mankind, that's why I connect this very much sort of like inland focus as something that is connected to Pramoedya's verdict of the Kampung civilization.
Thank you, Nila. There is Vince is going to ask a question. Can please, Vince?
Hello. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Bu Nila, for your very informative lecture. I have a couple of hopefully interrelated questions. First, you mentioned a while ago that Pramoedya was nominated a number of times for the Nobel Prize for Literature. What do you think accounts for Pramoedya's global renown? Perhaps from the Western perspective, okay, was it because of seemingly universal themes, his style, or more material, like effects of, wide-ranging translation, among others? My second question will be Pramoedya's influence. How do you think our young and mid-career authors in Indonesia engage with Pramoedya's works today? Say for example, I know that Eka Kurniawan, apart from Pramoedya, is being read in the Philippines a lot here. And Kurniawan himself, if I'm not mistaken, did a thesis on Pramoedya's works. So I'd like to know, apart from these authors we encounter in the Philippines, with other young and mid-career Indonesian authors, how is Pramoedya received? Thank you.
Thank you, Vince. Nila, please.
Thank you so much, Vince, for the question. Yeah, the first one is definitely fascinating, right? He's nominated a few times, which means that he bears some sort of global significance, right? And there's a global acknowledgement of his works. And I think it could not be divorced from the way Pramoedya entered the global sphere. And it was in the 70s through the eyes of journalists, right? So he was in Buru Island. Indonesia was very much scrutinized over the treatment of the prisoners in Buru Island. And the human rights discourse was very much high at the time. And I could not remember the name, but there's this journalist, Miriam Budiarjo. Was that correct, Ibu Mel?
Yeah.
Miriam? Oh, okay. Yeah. So Miriam Budiarjo was quite fundamental in kind of elevating, the conditions or the news of, this prison colony in Buru Island. So Pramoedya entered the global sphere because of these conjectures, right? And thus, when people read his works, people cannot necessarily divorce the ways in which he was treated by the Indonesian state and the ways in which the stories were written and formulated in Buru Island. Yeah, but I think outside of that, the stories themselves are very peculiar, right? Very fascinating, especially, and I think I mentioned a little bit, especially if we read them alongside other post-colonial kind of novels, right? Because there's definitely a strong nationalist element in the quartet that we might not necessarily see in other sort of post-colonial novels. So so maybe that element also became kind of like an alternative, quote unquote, to the global readers when they wanted to read something of sort of like a post-colonial literature. So that's my sense of Pramoedya's sort of like global presence. And now I couldn't remember the second question.
Oh, well, the second question is about the reception.
Oh, right.
But I think it should be connected to Gieti's question. There is a Gieti question here that is related to Finn's question. What do you think of Pramoedya's relevance for Indonesian youth in today's political context, as more and more of his works are being read or even adapted into texts that are more accessible for youth? For example, the 2019 movie. Okay, it's connected to Finn's questions about influence among the younger generation.
Yeah, this is very interesting. I could not necessarily consider myself as the young generation anymore. So in my time before the film was released, I was introduced to Pramoedya in the early 2000s, to Pramoedya's works in the early 2000s, right? I did not know anything about Pramoedya at that time. My first encounter with Pramoedya was his novel The Girl from the Coast. And then, of course, with the tetralogy. And it's interesting. It's not necessarily interesting, but because I studied in the Faculty of Humanities, like so many people have read his work. So it's not necessarily weird or unique to be, talking about Pramoedya in that context, in that space, right? But if you take him outside of this context of like the humanities or the arts enclaves, then it would become a completely different questions, right? None of my relatives knew about Pramoedya outside of the movie. So when the movie came out, there was a lot of debate about, oh, well, this is just a disservice to the great historical novel that is This Earth of Mankind. People were debating or criticizing the cast selection as well. But it was very intentional, right? The need to introduce Pramoedya's work to the young generation was important at this particular political climate in Indonesia, where, first of all, we see the rise of the conservative Islam in Indonesia. And I think also the lack of political imagination, right? Because, we see the same political parties, we see, the same people running for elections. I don't know to what extent, people, when the young people read his works or watch the movie, that is the kind of idea that they're getting. I don't have the research on that, but my sense is that the reintroduction of Pramoedya at that particular political moment is, or I hope, is an attempt to expand that political imagination that was very much, in deadlock after the 1998 Reformation era. There's, the young people was very much in politics, but at the same time, the machineries, right? It's not really the spirit of being involved in politics, but it's the machinery of the politics that is very much old colonial state. Yeah, it's very much old colonial state, which is the same thing that Minka was basically facing, right? In the Buruh Quartet. I don't know whether that answers the question, but, actually.
Finn's also asked about Eka Kurniawan and the other writers, whether other writers, younger writers, also get inspiration from Pramoedya or not. I don't know whether you want to comment.
I should hope so. I do not. I unfortunately do not have any sort of like connection to the literary circle in Indonesia. The very few folks that I know of who is in the literary circle, definitely not as big as Eka Kurniawan, but, you know, but at least is known, you know, sort of like domestically, do draw inspirations from Pramoedya, if not necessarily from the work in itself, probably from the methodological research, right? Or from his attention to history, his attention to geography. And yeah, and I think a lot of the young authors or writers that I know still puts Pramoedya on a pedestal.
Thank you. There is 2 questions here, Iping and Alex. Yeah. Iping, do we still have time? It's already 2 a.m. in
Yeah, maybe we can just with maybe 1 or 2 questions, you know.
Yeah, your question first then.
Sure, yeah. So thank you, Nila, because this is my first exposure to Pramoedya. So thank you for, you know, enlarging the scope, you know, putting his quartet in the context of the maritime historiography. So that wonderful for this connection. But my question is really simple, because at the very beginning, the first chapter where the protagonist, you know, starts the storytelling, right? So he starts, you know, people call me Minke. And we realize that Minke, the name is actually given to him by the teacher at the HBS. So I would like to ask you, is there in your reading, what is maybe the significance of the choice, the selection of the name Minge, and why the protagonist at the very beginning, you know, wants to hide it, you know, his own name. So this is, I don't know if you happen to have the book, beside you. So this is really a question that I like to ask you about the naming.
Okay, Nila.
Thank you, Iping. Yeah, I do have the book beside me.
Yeah, sure.
And I do remember this part, but please do correct me if I'm wrong in remembering. I think 2 things. So first of all, the way I read it is kind of like a reclaiming, right? So even though that name was given to him as kind of like a mockery, but exactly. The way, right, the way he was able to bring dignity into it as a reclaim. So instead of like changing his name or using his real name, let me be known as this name that people mock me with, but in the end I mock them with. Exactly. So it's kind of like putting a mirror, right? Putting a mirror onto this colonial regime, and he does that through his writing, right? And he would use Minke. So that's my sense. But another side to that is, I believe, and Ibu Mel, please correct me if I'm wrong, the use of pseudonyms is also very common in that era. So a lot of authors, I mean, those Dekker used the pseudonym Multatuli, you know, there's right. Yeah. There are different authors in that particular era who also use pseudonyms. So in that sense, hiding themselves from, you know, the glass house of the colonial power through the use of pseudonym is also a resistance, an act of resistance. So I would see that in these 2 ways of like active resistance.
Thank you, Nila.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Now, Iping, we still have 2 more questions, and then we have to close this session. Yeah. Okay. Alex, you want to have a short second question, please?
Oh, okay. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So my question is that it's related to this attitude towards his ancestors, because commonly in post-colonial imaginings, it involves a reconnection with the past. But if Pramoedya is sort of consistent with some sourness towards ancestors, and you also mentioned he might have a different interpretation of class or orthodox rather than the orthodox interpretation. Maybe this is involved, but does he actually offer an alternative path out? And this is maybe not a short question, so you can feel free not to answer if you want. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Nila.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, yeah, I don't know where to start with that. Let me start with the class question. I don't know for sure why I mentioned that Pramoedya might have a different interpretation of class is because when I forgot whether this was in Hilmar Farid's dissertation or it is from one of my conversations with him, but Phi would talk a lot with Pramoedya and being kind of like a Marxist scholar that he is, would oftentimes discuss his class. But if I remember correctly, and I might be wrong here, Pramoedya basically, like told him that, oh, you don't, class is not kind of like the right lens to examine the Indonesian society. I could not remember sort of like what's the continuation of that, or whether that was just one of the conversations that Phi and Pramoedya had at the time of Phi's writing his dissertations. I hope I can ask Phi what was the continuation of that, but that's like the snippets that I kind of remember from that particular conversations. And about the sourness to the ancestors, and I think this was very much kind of like visible in the way Minka was so uncomfortable, right? Every time he came home to B, to the city B, like he had to crawl in order to meet his father. He had to bow, he had to use a particular language, so the kind of this conventional traditions that put someone on a hierarchy and others very low at the opposite of that is something that he definitely despises. And not to say that this does not continuously happen, because if I remember correctly, in one of the maybe it's in Footsteps or in Glass House, I couldn't remember, but there's this one time that Minka talked to, he has a maid, right? So one time he talked to his maid and asking for something. I think he was about to be arrested at that time, and then he asked his maid to do something, and then this female maid told Minka that I am a member of the Sarekat, of the union, and that, but she still calls him master, right? But knowing that the maid was part of the union transformed the relationship, but at the same time also there are certain aspects of it that are the same. So I think this is the kind of difficulties of dealing with traditions, dealing with the legacies of the traditions that can still but Pramoedya shows that there are potentials to transform these relationships, there are potential to transform these traditions, but not without difficulties. I think that's probably like the shortest of an answer that I can give.
Okay, now we will close the session with the question from Pak Wahyono from Palembang, Wahyono Saputro from Palembang. Please, Pak, you can come. You can directly ask question to Ibu Nila. Is Pak Wahyono here? Otherwise, I would read the question. The faith of the natives is so weak in the eyes of Europeans. This is a quote from Pramoedya. What do you think? What do you think? I think Pramoedya's idea, so that Indonesia is empowered and equal to other nations. I think it's also about trajectories, yeah, that Pramoedya has about alternative currents. Okay.
Thank you, Pak Wahyono. Yeah, what do you think so that Indonesia is empowered and equal to other nations? I think I don't know, like learning from Pramoedya, it's definitely an attention to our histories, right? We don't look to our histories the way we should, through critical lens, but also through an understanding that the histories that we have been offered with is a selected history, right? Selected and very much with certain interpretations and certain colonial lenses as well. And yeah, like expanding the political imagination of what a nation could be. And I think it could be as simple as revisiting what is the meaning of the nation, right? Because I think the nation so far, Bumel, correct me if I'm wrong, if we translate that into Indonesian, we call it bangsa. But bangsa has a particular kind of like ethnic racial undertones, which is absolutely not the spirit of the nation, right? That's why in the 50s and the 60s, we use nation instead of bangsa. But now we easily translate nation as bangsa. So I think just as simple as revisiting, that idea of what is the nation and what does it mean in our current political imagination and for the future of our political imagination is probably a good place to start.
Thank you, Nila. With that, I think we should close the session. I don't need to wrap up because it's been so rich. And I think this open up our future discussion about the directions of land and water trajectories, our historical perspective, our relations with other nation, transnational relations, and other topics that will be continued in this Zoom. Thank you so much for your presentation, Nila. It's been very enriching and insightful. And thank you, Iping, for your very, organized and very consistent organizing.
Yeah, putting together the series of talks. Yeah, I got thank you, Nila, because I know it is probably 1:30 or maybe 2 o'clock your time in Vancouver. But before we say goodbye, and of course, our big thanks to Nila and also to Melani for your wonderful moderation, for the Q&A and introduction of the speaker. Can everyone turn on your camera so we can take, that Lulu says, a photo that
well, it's a pity. Before it was 60 something. Now it's already
because people have to leave.
Leave,
of course, right. So that hiding so that our assistant can take a screenshot and everyone can take a screenshot, that you can post anywhere on your FB, with your friends and so on and so forth. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Nila. And I don't know, but for me and my students, okay, this is our first time inauguration, okay, of a major writer from Indonesia who is being historically important. And I thank again to Nila's wonderful talk that opens up this larger scope of historical imagination of the nation ahead. And that this wonderful talk about this currents connecting us with water and the land, and I think that we will do so very soon in mid-June. Do we have the poster for the next talk, Frank?
So the picture session is already finished?
Yeah, I think the picture is already finished. Yeah, thank you, Melani. Thank you. Thank you. Right. Yeah, so that our next talk is actually 2 weeks from today. Yeah, this is our Critical Island Study Conference, right? So the next talk is about 2 weeks or 3 weeks from today, is again on Wednesday, June the 14th, and we will continue our currents along the waters and the islands. And our speaker for next time is Professor Alex Lee at Kyung-hee University. I know that many of you know him. And our moderator for this next session is our Sir Olga Gambo Mane. And the topic for the talk in mid-June is Ontology of an Archipelagic Subject. So thank you again. And with that, we look forward to seeing you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
You can catch a little bit of sleep.
I hope so,
sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Prof. Mel, Nila.
Thank you.